Welcome everyone. Today we have another new episode, and this is very, very important for Malaysia and Asia Pacific because we will discuss on nanotechnology and smart devices. I'm sure we have our world famous speakers, those who have best analysis on nanotechnology. We will learn more from Mr. Rob, Mr. Stewarts, Professor Edwards, as well as my friend, Mr. Aaron. So I want to start from Professor Rob. How do you want to analyze today's topic, and what is the feedback you want to give about nanotechnology and smart devices?
Right. Okay. So nanotechnology and smart devices. Is it smart devices or smart materials?
Materials. Oh, sorry about that. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, a little bit of difference. So the nanoparticles are particles between 1 and 100 nanometers. There are instances where people have gone up to 500 nanometers and still talk about them in terms of nanoparticles. They're used as coatings for the most part. And when they're used on glass, for instance, the particles will repel water. They're used for ultra dark finishes. It's technology that allows you to enhance certain objects often by coating them with these small particles. Sometimes it drifts into nanomachines, which we're a long way away from, but we can now laser engrave particles of this size and smaller, all the way down to atomic sizes. So and then with regard to smart materials are typically materials that do stuff all by themselves. Really not a lot of intelligence in it. Really not like clear why we call them smart, because they aren't, but they do other stuff. Metals that will move with heat, plastics that will reform themselves. Smart glass is the area that I've spent most of my time with. Initially, smart glass is glass that when current is applied will become opaque, and when the current is withdrawn, it is clear. The next generation smart glass is more of a display technology where the window could turn into anything else, any viable display, most often now demonstrated in autonomous vehicles as a way to share entertainment. You use the windshield and the side windows as a way to watch movies or whatever while the car is driving itself. We'll see how that works. The most interesting implementation I've seen was one done by Intel a couple years back, where the view outside the car looked like you were driving through some other type of world. It was pretty interesting. It looked pretty exciting. Oh, and one final advancement with regard to smart glass, which is kind of all over the map, is glass that can be turned into solar receptors. So your windows could generate electricity as a result of the sun hitting them. So it's kind of an overview of at least what I know about nanoparticles and smart materials.
Thank you. We have our friends, Mr. Stewart. I'm sure he has a very good collaborations with Malaysia, Malaysian Sultan and other family anyway. So we will learn from him about nanotechnology, what's going on. How do you want to share your experience about Malaysia?
Okay, well, I've just explained my experience. Whilst I'm looking down here is because I'm trying to put new SIM cards into new phones whilst doing this. For me, that's where nanotechnology starts, because it's about as small as my fingers can cope with. Listen, I think just to kind of pick up with things, I mean, I'm not a scientist, so let's start from that point of view, and I'm never going to profess to be an expert in this area. And we're mostly kind of aware of this kind of increase of use of kind of nanotechnology and also smart materials that are kind of growing every day and every kind of all the time. And I think their roles are inextricably linked, being something both that are reliant on this kind of as this technology develops. It covers a number of key areas that as investors we have a high interest in. The main focus being that they have a broad role to play in impact and also advancement in various industry sectors. I mean, I think in some ways science is a far too broad perspective when looking at things like this. And I think kind of, you have to drill down to areas like engineering, healthcare, medicine, and more specific technology. And I think this is a really exciting area to look forward to, actually, as it's, and some I think are more wary because of the nature and not being able to see or understand it. I can see two kind of highlight focuses for us on this kind of relative area to where we see there's a kind of a significant investment, and that being kind of healthcare and also what I call the kind of green environment and infrastructure. Now, in terms of being smart, we understand, and Rob gave us a really nice introduction around this. These materials are ones that can adjust to the environment within which we exist. So they can relate to kind of thermal properties or shape memory or electric responsive materials. And when looking at the use of this technology, especially around things like green advancement, we see their use as being more kind of proactive and being a response to the changing environment. And for us as investors, we look at this as an ability to see increased efficiency, as well as the ability to maybe even like protect surroundings and act in a more reliable manner. It also means that the material can adapt to the surroundings and changes. And this can include a direct response. So like adapting to temperature in smaller areas, or something like an impacted protective clothing, or something that kind of offers greater flexibility whilst retaining its strength. External influences can vary as well, and that can act in a combination, which means materials need to adapt to kind of what we consider like kind of quite unique situations. So it may vary things like change in moisture, temperature, and light, and how it has to adapt in that way. Now, I mean, why nanotechnology? And this is something of kind of, someone said to me, isn't that about tiny dust-sized robots spying on you or something, And I love that kind of, that whole perspective of being so small you can't see it, we don't know whether it's here. But of course, when it comes to things like delivery of material, it can be done at increasingly small size. And it means actually the combination of smart materials that you can actually add it to existing situations. And it allows developments to be achieved at like a lower cost and a greater speed. Now, I think when I was kind of looking this up earlier, I was kind of reading about some of this stuff. It's quite interesting. And, the whole shape-shifting environment, I think, we saw in things like the Terminator 2 film, that kind of perspective is a really good way of starting to understand how materials can adapt. I know that's sci-fi. I know it's probably way in the future. Well, I hope it is anyway. But we can see some significant changes and differences coming about. And I think they're becoming quite intrinsic in society today. And the idea of having, for example, I've got these mobile phones in front of me, having a screen that repairs itself. That is just brilliant, especially when it comes to my teenage children. I mean, much has talked about the role of things like graphene and various materials, which is really helpful. And I think in terms of nanotechnology, one area just to kind of highlight is being able to target specific areas when we look at medicines and use materials safely on a kind of this really small, I suppose, nanoscale, I suppose you call it, or micro scale, nanoscale. And it's a great way of being able to deal with rather this kind of broader chemical radiotherapeutic kind of perspective. So I'm going to pause there and let everyone else have a chat, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Professor Edward, so what the things you want to share with us?
Well, it's Rob and Stuart have done a very good job, as I always expect. But just to put a little bit more perspective here, just to give your audience a little bit of history, this whole notion of nanotechnology, you might say, really came from a scientist, Richard Feynman, who wrote a famous essay called "There's Plenty of Room at the Bottom." We think of engineering as building buildings and machines and all. And he, of course, Feynman, is an absolutely brilliant individual. And I recommend you read some of his popular works, discussed, what can we do in terms of something very, very small, and engineering literally on a micro level. And I think he set up a prize, which was won fairly quickly, to create the smallest machine possible. And that's really got people's imagination going. And then the other great pioneer, who I believe is in Texas, if I'm correct, is Eric Drexler, who I guess it was 25 years ago, maybe a little bit longer, wrote his famous book, Engines of Creation, which, again, also discussed how to do that. And he's, again, one of the pioneers of nanotechnology. But as Stuart has indicated, I think the most exciting thing is to think of nanotechnology and materials sciences in general as one of the incredible inputs that entrepreneurs can use to better our products, to better our environment, to better our health and the like. That's what I always emphasize: the entrepreneur, the individual's thinking, well, what can I do with this? Maybe I can coach my thing here so that when my 10-year-olds grab my phone and throw it around, it won't break as much or whatever. And some of the things that Rob has mentioned as well. I want to highlight a couple of areas, though. I'm very interested in the biotech and medical area. And while it's still off in the future, one of the most promising things about nanomachines and nanobots is, for example, to go into the body and to inject some kind of material or medication or whatever into at a cellular level. For example, to find the cancer cell and not to remember something about chemotherapy. Chemotherapy for cancer sufferers is you basically poison the individual, and you hope that the poison kills the cancer before it kills the individual. And of course, anyone who's experienced that or has relatives experienced that knows how terrible it is. The ability to go in there and to target the poison, so to speak, or the turning off function just to the cancer cells would be a revolutionary. Or the other area that's very, very difficult in medical treatments is getting into the brain. The brain is incredibly well protected. So getting medications into the brain is very, very difficult. And so here's something where nano bots or nanomachines or whatever could really help. Respirants is the idea of being able to put something into your lungs that can breathe much, much better than you can breathe is another very interesting possible application of nanotechnology. By the way, I'll just mention that there was a survey done by the Pew organization here in the United States, I believe it was in 2016, that showed that the public was very concerned about these sorts of things. And in fact, they even mentioned, something that would make your lungs 3 times or 5 times better than someone else's lungs in terms of breathing. And a lot of people said, well, that would create a super race and this would be bad and so forth. But, there's always fear of new technologies, that there's going to be some kind of a division. But remember, you have beta users who will, initially use the material or take the treatment, and then it improves. And the other thing I'll just mention is in terms of materials, and I've mentioned this before, is building a space elevator has been an idea going back quite a few decades. And the big problem with that is that we have the carbon nanotubes that seem to be strong enough, but being able to get the tubes to connect and stay that way has been the materials challenge. Imagine a zipper that if you have a coat or something like that, and if one little, part of the zipper, one little metal piece comes undone, the whole zipper comes undone. And that's been the challenge in terms of using nanomaterials to create something strong enough to make literally a space elevator, something that goes all the way up into orbit. Instead of launching rockets, you go that way. But anyway, the point is that nanomaterials are very, very exciting. And for your listeners, especially those going into universities and studying, again, entrepreneurs, think of nanomaterials as one of the possible inputs that you can take to solve some sort of a problem or create some sort of a new invention or device that's going to hopefully profit you and profit all the rest of us.
Thank you. Mr. Aaron, how do you want to analyze, and what type of industrial experience you want to share with us?
As always, you have just the best speakers on your show. I think everybody's given, a really good overview so far. I'm personally very excited about graphene and DNA computing. As far as graphene goes, you have a material that's incredibly strong. It can, under certain situations, produce current, it can store, it can insulate. The applications are really practically limitless. It also superconducts at a higher temperature than, as far as my research is concluded, pretty much anything else we've got at this point. The catch being, of course, pressure, but it's a pretty small catch in exchange for the, the temperature range that it superconducts in. As far as DNA computing goes, as Mr. Professor Hughes was saying there, you have the ability in the future to use DNA computing and, small machines built of organic compounds and structures to target specific cancer cells to regrow bone material. I mean, heck, we're looking at, the ability to, grow or create tissues, for transplants. This could be this is going to be life changing. But one of the biggest things is, producing materials, especially on the graphene. There's actually been incredible leaps and bounds made in the production end of it over the last 10 years, since it was, pretty much first, extracted using adhesive tape. Now we've gotten to the point where we can make, football fields of the stuff, which we're only getting better at that. And us only getting better at that is only going to usher in whole new eras of things like supercomputers to build better smart machines, better small machines, better smart materials. I'm very excited about this entire field. I had quite a few more points, but honestly, everybody else touched on them already. So just incredible, guys. I'm very excited.
Thank you. Professor Donald, I have a specific question because today we get different kind of call from different university professors, from Dhaka University, from other universities, especially they are based in Asia Pacific and government universities. The professor has complained like that the governments of developing nations, they do not invest enough money for research and product innovation. Practically, I want to know, like from USA, like how much government or industry invest on research and innovations. I want to learn from both, from Europe, like I'm sure that, and from USA, because this is very crucial, because in COVID-19 situations, even government developing their budget and everything. So major thing is that major complaint from developing nations, they do not do enough investment. But I just do not want to compare, because US economy or UK economy is very big, but I just want to know the culture, what's going on inside this research and innovation industry.
Well, that's a good question that I actually somewhat know the answer to. I'd like to first off thank Edward for mentioning Drexler and Feynman, and take a teeny little sidetrack about Feynman. You can get Feynman's physics lectures at MIT on Open MIT. And I have found that people that really, 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 really understand something can explain it in a way that I can understand it. People who don't understand it very well, go back and they say all this extra stuff because they're confused about it. But Feynman is, well, he's Richard Feynman. And he used to go into his physics lecture, and he had a gigantic ball, metal ball, that he'd attached to the roof of the lecture room. And he would put it right in front of his face, and he'd let it go and continue with his lecture. And the ball would swing across the lecture hall, and then it would come back and stop a few millimeters in front of his face, and then do that again. And he said, I do that because I believe in what I'm teaching. And he also quit everything for a while and went to Brazil and learned samba. And he became a great samba expert and really enjoyed himself.
And bongos.
Yeah, he's written some books like, what is it? A question, Mr. Feynman.
Surely
so
you just,
popular
Mr. Feynman.
books. He's really, really worth studying. He's one of the great geniuses. So in answer to your question, I want to start out by first pointing out that nanotechnology is not exactly a thing. Drexler invented the term, but within it, a rough division is between mechanical and biological. And in a sense, there's getting to be a convergence of those things. And when Edward was talking about biological nanotechnology, it's useful to remember that it was lipid nanotechnology that allowed us to deliver the RNA into our cells for the COVID vaccine that were developed by Pfizer and by Moderna. The way that they work is that they created this little strand of messenger RNA that then had to get into the cell for the cell's mechanisms to be able to start manufacturing the protein that the immune system recognized. And once it learned to recognize that particular strand of a protein, then when the COVID virus gets into you, your immune system is already prepared to get it. And that, if you look it up, that's nanotechnology. Another use for biological nanotechnology is artificial muscles, which they can use for both people and robots. So you can actually, they have materials that with a charge of your nervous system can actually contract and expand just like regular muscles. So there's an incredible work that's done in that direction. And then one of the main things nanotechnology was used for initially is simple things like making a coating on something that's basically a molecule thick. And nano just means, is kind of generally means very small. And so these, if you think about it, one of the reasons airplane surfaces are so stable is that they make them out of, well, now they make them out of plastic, but for years they made them out of aluminum. And aluminum creates, it oxidizes. And so there's one single thin layer on the top of aluminum that's actually sapphire. That's what sapphire is aluminum oxide. So that basically sapphire coating protects aluminum. That's why it doesn't corrode much. And so anyway, so nano materials, and I really like what Mr. O'Hagan, what's your name again? Alex, right? No,
Aaron.
Aaron. Okay, so I really like what Aaron was saying about superconductors. And in case somebody doesn't know, a superconductor, what happens is if you drop the temperature of many metals all the way down to absolute zero, which is several hundred degrees centigrade below regular zero, it gets to the point where the molecules kind of stop moving. Like molecules are always bouncing around and moving inside, even inside of metal. And once that happens, you can have an electric current that goes from one place to another with no resistance. So in theory, if you could come up with an electrical grid where everything was superconducting, you wouldn't waste any electricity. It wouldn't be transferred into heat. It would just simply go from one place to another without resistance. So that's what superconductors are. Sadly, they have to be cooled down to these incredibly low temperatures. But with new materials, we're getting that temperature higher and higher and higher. And the dream is to develop a material that we don't have to cool at all. Who knows? Maybe we'll get there. That's an interesting thing. I was involved for a while with joint venture Silicon Valley with nanotechnology in Silicon Valley. And at one point, I actually arranged for the vice chancellor of Austria to come into the nanotechnology labs that UC Santa Cruz developed at the old NASA site, where they've taken over a lot of buildings over in Mountain View, or is it San Mateo? Anyway, they
Mountain View,
yeah, Mountain View, and so they and there was a great deal of interest in it. And Joint Silicon Valley is a consortium where many of the major companies basically get together to try and understand Silicon Valley and make it better. And with nanotechnology, they made a point at the time that it's a lot more difficult to just you do research or make things with nanotechnology in your garage. Because if you have to create these super complicated metal combinations of molecules, or lower the temperature to near absolute zero, and things like that, it requires very, very expensive equipment. So what Joint Venture Silicon Valley did is they did an inventory of the laboratory space in Silicon Valley to try and identify laboratory space that wasn't being completely used, and make that available to entrepreneurs so that they could come into these laboratories and do creative things with nanotechnology. So this is a very interesting point. When the inventory showed that there was 4 trillion worth of lab space in Silicon Valley, which is when somebody's trying to copy Silicon Valley, they definitely have that barrier to get over. I mean, that's
Yes.
that's more than the GDP of Finland by far. So anyway, regardless, there was a lot of interest in the time at building laboratory space, and it was part of it was government, because UC Santa Cruz is the state of California, and part of it was a consortium of industry. I think that when you're thinking about nanotechnology, it's important to remember that in a way, it's not a thing. It's a lot of different things under one umbrella term. So if you're smaller and you don't just happen to have $4 trillion worth of lab space that you can allow entrepreneurs to use, then it makes sense to look at the whole range. And you don't have to develop nanomaterials to use them. So entrepreneurs can find and use things that are being done all over the world. And I would suggest that maybe we'll talk about that more in what the opportunities are more in the rest of the show.
Thank you. Professor Edward, I'm coming to you. Before that, I want to give chance to Professor Rob. Yes.
Yeah, and what chance do you want to give me?
No, we love to learn more about the research center of IBM or any industrial research center, how they invest. I know many corporations from developing nations, they have interest, but it's actually culture. It's actually environment. They have to learn. And I'm sure this content is very much valuable for the entrepreneurs, the corporations, those who want to invest more on nanotechnology. So I love.
They're specialty areas. I mean, they require specialists that have been focused on these areas for a period of time. And as we pointed out, nanotechnology is very broad. It really just refers to things of a certain size, and that size being very small. The interesting part that I left out of my opening brief was the biological aspects of nanotechnology, and the idea that we could use small devices, either made of materials or biological. And while I'm thinking about it, DNA computing, that was brought up earlier. I just want to make sure we're clear on the definition of DNA computing. A DNA computer is a computer that's built with biological materials. If you were to construct a brain for a human or an animal, that would be a DNA computer. The difference is the materials that are being used, and it's a biological construct as opposed to a construct of electronics. Interesting area of study. A lot of us believe that that when it comes to enhancing humans, the DNA computer approach would be far better, because it would be more compatible with our physical bodies. Elon Musk is doing some work with regard to brain-machine interfaces, but he's using a metal, a thin wire, a micro wire interface. And the concern is, of course, is your brain is a living structure, will stretch and contract and react, and those metal wires will not. So that they could end up doing a substantial amount of damage. And since they're surgically embedded, getting them out again would be kind of problematic as well. So I'm not envying the first volunteers that go for his brain interface, because metals inserted into the brain would have some interesting and probably debilitating long-term adverse impacts. But the right way to do it would be biological. So the construct and the mechanism that it's altering both can grow, contract, heal, and do the things that biological beings can do. In terms of research, IBM Labs is a good example, just like the old Bell Labs were. The IBM Labs is one of the last industry-funded efforts that is broad in nature. In IBM Labs, they do research on everything from clean water to nanotechnology to generating or developing the next quantum or artificial intelligence. So some things tied to what IBM does, some things not so much. They're just research efforts and targeted at either making the world a better place or solving a particular problem that the researchers want to solve. bit different than what it used to be. It used to be almost pure research, and it was kind of funny. You go for a tour in IBM labs, and you'd see all this wonderful stuff that would never make it out of IBM labs because nobody knew how to market it or any of the other stuff. It was just kind of fun. It was very much like Xerox PARC, who also developed a bunch of just amazing stuff they didn't know how to do anything with. You might recall that Xerox PARC developed the mouse, as well as the early concepts of the personal computer. But they never did anything with it. And Apple and IBM and Microsoft all ran with that technology later on. But in terms of unfocused research, IBM Labs is probably one of the few places where a lot of that's still done, though not to the degree it once was. In terms of picking research projects, in most cases, industry picks projects that are aligned with what it is they do. So a lab tied to Intel is mostly focused on stuff that Intel's planning and carrying forward. Often, and I've had several lab tours with them, one of the most interesting projects they did was the ability to take headlights and have them super penetrate rain and snow. In fact, they did the rain pretty easy. What was amazing is that it would work on snow as well, and what the technology did is would flash the headlights at a very high rate of speed, so that you could see through the storm because the light wasn't being reflected back from either the snow or the rain. It was something you wouldn't think would work, but in the demonstrations, it was phenomenal. Almost made it look like the rain disappeared, almost magical in nature. Now back to nanoparticles and smart materials. Generally the efforts that would be funded by a government entity or an industry player in that space would be tied to either something the government needed solved. So I would say the most lucrative right now would be the applicability of nanomaterials against a medical threat. As Donald pointed out, it's been very effective in battling COVID, and that's where the need is greatest at a city-state level. And the government would probably be best at funding research into an area that would benefit their citizens, particularly in emerging economies, using nanotechnology to better filter water, to deliver medications, perhaps without using a needle. When we've done this in the past with microvapors pumped in through the skin, sadly we stopped doing that. I'm not a big fan of needles. I actually preferred that method, though it didn't hurt any less. But in doing research in areas that would benefit the population, one of the areas, of course, for research is in agriculture. We've drifted around global warming a few times and climate change, but that's having the most massive impact on our agricultural area, and using these technologies to create more robust plants and mechanisms that could better fight plant-borne diseases and pests without using pesticides would be good areas to focus on for research, because that would benefit the ecology of the country and perhaps make their failing farm industry more viable.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Mr. Stewart, what about UK?
Yeah, you can hear me now. Sorry, I was pressing the wrong mouse. The other computer was live, I wasn't. I mean, the UK I think, has always led in many ways or tried to compete actively within the technology sector. So this is seen as an area. I think it was Donald, you were saying about, this is something it can be done on a small scale. Well, we're a small country, so that kind of suits us in some ways. We don't have the vast area and size of the USA or other kind of large countries. So maybe nanotechnology is the way for us to go forward. Watch this space. I think also in terms of technology, in terms of infrastructure and design towards that's been a big focus. I wanted to kind of lean into one area in particular, which I think from an investment, the economic environmental sector and perspective there, and that is what we're learning from nature. So one of the biggest crises we see at the moment is the kind of issue around the destruction of biodiversity, and the fact that we tend to work in opposition to nature. And in fact, nanotechnology, and especially smart materials actually in particular, is a way where we can start to align ourselves better with nature and understand nature in a better way. And I think one of the things that I kind of came across recently was this kind of use of a synthetic spider web, where you have a silk-like construct and smart material that can adapt and is, many times strong. Well, we've all seen Spider-Man, so we know what it's all about. But but it's many times stronger than steel. It has much better elasticity and has a way of being able to react and deal with things. And I think one of the focuses we need to kind of bring in terms of this, in terms of both nanotechnology and smart materials and the combined impact of these, is how we can watch how nature has adapted and worked for, because that actually is the place we need to understand best, rather than strive out. And in the UK, and I know actually in Malaysia and Asia Pacific, it's a big area of development in terms of how they can lead the world in this kind of not just area, but in terms of broader technology, especially in computing as well. But in terms of the smart materials, it's going to be down to, this could be a building material. It could be a synthetic skin, a dermatological kind of addition. There's lots of things that could be used in a particular way. But we need to look how that nature has adapted to this and managed this, and how that has been brought forward. One of the areas which is really interesting also, and which I kind of was quite interesting to understand. I don't know whether anybody else here on the panel has better knowledge. Well, you probably have. I'm going to second guess that one. Is around 4D printing. So we've understood this development around 3D printing kind of vastly going forward. This whole kind of, you've seen it in schools where they kind of do this amazing kind of printing of a 3D plastic object, which is usually useless or maybe purposeful, but it's understanding the technology and the adaptability behind it. With 4D, you have this real-time ability to adapt and change something that can be done in a way that has a better use in terms of its reactiveness and its ability to be used. So it's, when it comes to medical science, things like stents or small items, to be able to do that, it's there's a really kind of progressive perspective. And 4D printing is very cutting edge. It's very new, and it's something which I think is going to probably lead in the development around smart materials. I think it was Aaron. With Aaron, you talked about graphene. You're quite excited about graphene. Absolutely, and we kind of known about graphene for a while in its development. But in terms of one of the biggest areas around development and technology is batteries and storage of energy. And of course, graphene has a big role to play in that. And in terms of that, it can create quite an autonomous environment and be quite adaptable. And I'm not going to pretend to understand the full science behind it, but we've seen kind of graphene as this kind of coming to play in many different areas. And there are other properties that it can come to support. So yeah, I mean, it's a very exciting time. Back to you, Sherry.
Thank you. Professor Edward, I have one question for you. It's common that what is the environment like, research environment, and how US government and corporation, they do invest on research. Beside that, I love to learn more, because from Asia Pacific, what I understand, Japan is very dynamic in terms of investment in research, because we get a regular call from different corporations from Japan. They're looking for new startup, new research, new innovations. And with my organizations already, we introduce very innovative research from different developing nations, and they already invest on it. And the like corporation like USA has this kind of environment, or how they do that. But from Asia Pacific, we observe that Japan corporations, they are very dynamic and they are very aggressive for innovations and this kind of thing.
Indeed. In fact, one of the areas I've done work in is pharmaceuticals and sort of the broad industry for developing new cures for diseases and so forth. And Japan has been very much involved in those efforts. And in fact, Japan has something very unique in the world that we're trying to do here. They have right now in the United States, if you want to get a new product, treatment, medical device approved for the market, you have to go through our Food and Drug Administration. They have a whole series of steps that were created in 1962. They've been updated, but it takes 10 to 12 years and costs $3 billion to get new products from research lab to market. What Japan did a few years ago was created a parallel track for medicines or for treatments, so that while they're in clinical trials, more people have access to them, and plus the data is becoming in real time, so that researchers can look at it and physicians can look at it and all. It's just done for certain kinds of biologics and mainly focused on the fact that Japan has the oldest population or the most aged population. So they really need breakthroughs in these kinds of areas very, very quickly. So Japan has been very innovative. And of course, that means that they want their businesses and government to put more money into this specific kind of research because of their aging population. I could go over other examples about Japan, which is very interesting. But to the wider question you asked about research, I saw figures, this was a few years ago, that if you look back 30 or 40 or 50 years ago in the United States, 2/3 of basic research was government funded in some way, shape, or form. Today, it's the other way around. 2/3 of it tends to be the private sector. Now, of course, that depends on how you define research. But the point is, it does point out, especially in areas of information, communication, the sort of things that we've been talking about with computers and the like. You see in Xerox PARC was a good example. And of course, it was an Apple computer that ended up taking their technology because they didn't know what to do with it. But that's the sort of trend we've seen in the United States. You do have a model of what we call the skunk works, which is where, and Rob could probably talk about this even more than I can, about where a company will set up a sort of a lab to sort of everybody. You're not worried about quarterly reports and all. You're just all focused on how to do this one thing. And so there's this kind of model of setting aside a part of your company to do that kind of research and not have to worry about all the sort of deadlines that you might have if you're trying to produce a product for market. We also have, of course, in this country, lots of partnerships with government. In some cases, it is just, well, the government has all this laboratory space that's not being used. Well, why not let the private sector rent it out or use it? Mountain View, California, I know, is one of the areas where you have this going on. And one sense, you could say, well, it's not so much the government as the government's letting the private sector use the facilities or rent the facilities. You had the same thing at Cape Canaveral or the Kennedy Space Center, and plus the Air Force facility next door, letting private companies basically use those launch facilities or rent those launch facilities. And of course, you have government contracting out for different kinds of research and different kinds of services. Much research is done in the universities. It's often done under a government contract, but that's the sort of thing that you see. Certainly in the area that I'm at, I'm right outside of Washington, D.C., and we have a thing called the I-270 corridor. I-270 is a big highway, and we have dozens and dozens of biotech companies. Many of them are private companies doing private stuff. The AstraZeneca the vaccine was developed in some of the areas here, but you also have a lot of the companies that are on government contracts for stuff. But again, the government contracting out is one of the models. And the other thing I want to say in terms of Asia Pacific is your research, your university should be a little bit careful about reinventing the wheel. In other words, if somebody else is doing it and somebody else is doing it better, then don't say, well, we have to do it as well, because you're probably not going to be adding anything necessarily new. If you can partner, for example, with American universities or Western universities, UK, wherever it happens to be, that might be a better model for your universities and even for your companies. Again, I mentioned Japan, and I happen to know that Japan has a lot of joint projects with US, Canadian, and other companies. And in part with, for example, pharmaceuticals, if they have trouble getting it through the regulatory process here, well, we just go to Japan. Canada does the same sort of thing. So think of it as an international effort and not just, well, should the government of Bangladesh pour more money into a university to research some particular issue when it might be it's being done out there anyway. So think strategically.
Yes, thank you. This is actually our objective, because developing nations, they also different business organizations, they are growing, they are interested to invest on research and innovations. So we are making the collaborations every show. After the show, not only Bangladesh, I'm sure there is a 30 different country from Asia Pacific. I'm like different ministry, different corporation, we share our content every day. So even different university, and we are collaborating with many organizations, and we want to convince different corporations how they can invest more money for this kind of nanotechnology, biotechnologies, and different smart things. And we need more collaborations with developed nation. Mr. Aaron, I think you are also working with green technology. So what your experience?
So one of the things, and this is going to be a ways off in the future, but one of the implications of all this is that you will have the ability one day to have a coating for an entire building, let's say, that functions as a membrane that's adapted to light and heat, that is able to harness solar energy, and put that power into the grid from individual buildings to where entire cities could be producing at least a large percentage of their power needs. You also have a broader application in agriculture where you can have these small biomachines, these nano biomachines, kind of integrated into the agricultural system or the ecosystem to supplement nutrients, to convert this into that, to kind of augment the natural processes or whatever is stripped from agriculture. So that could lead to, one of the ways of combating, food shortages as a result of climate change. And these could be very, very powerful implications. So that's pretty much just my the things that I'm excited to see coming in the future. Yeah.
Thank you. Professor Donald. Unmute, please.
Remember what I said about nanotechnology being a number of different things. And so what that implies is whatever you're good at, look at the way that you could use nanotechnology or do it for smaller and smaller levels. It's sort of one thing that's sort of confusing is that we talk about biological and mechanical nanotechnology. One of the examples of using nanotechnology in a more mechanical sense is the making chips. Like the latest generation of chips, the basically wires between the transistors are 5 nanometers. That's an incredible scientific feat, because once you get down to 5 nanometers, you're starting to run into quantum effects and things like that are causing them to behave in ways that are new and unusual. So people have to study that. So if you're trying to do that, like as an individual, what you're going to need to study is basically quantum physics and physics, because we're getting down to the quantum level. And it goes back to what I've said in show after show, is you really need to learn your basic mathematics, calculus, and linear algebra, and a few things like that to be able to understand what people are talking about when they're talking about that stuff. And then there's the biological aspect of it too, where we're talking about nanotechnology being used. Are we talking about robots? Well, it goes back to Feynman's paper. In his talk, there was a line that he said, in principle, there's no reason why we can't build things atom by atom. And that was a line from that talk. And so what are chemical reactions? What happens when we add oxygen to carbon dioxide? We get carbolic acid. We've changed it one molecule at a time. So chemical reactions are one way that we can modify things one atom at a time. And then how do they get 5 nanometer in circuits? They use they etch them. So that's another way that we can do it. So there's multiple ways that we can do things where we're basically building things atom by atom. We're down to that level. As I said before, the equipment to do this is fantastically expensive. Building a semiconductor plant costs many billions of dollars. And so that's why joint venture Silicon Valley was invented. It was trying to collaborate between the university labs and the laboratories that were available. Berkeley had the world's brightest light. Somebody had the world's brightest light. Berkeley had the world's fastest computer at the time. Now I think the fastest computers are in China. But regardless, the difference between them is not that great. But the point I'm trying to get to is emphasizing what other people have said is that the key is collaboration. And American universities are back to this system where people from other countries are more accepted. I mean, we were that way forever, and then what's his name? That loser president. I don't like to say his name. I know who he is, but I'm not going to. That's what he wants, so I'm not going to do it. In any event, he tried to end this, but in the research I've done in Silicon Valley and Stanford, half of the companies in Silicon Valley, more than half, were started by immigrants, many of them from Southeast Asia. That's a definitely main source, China and India. And so and many of them go back. They come here, they learn stuff, they learn to be entrepreneurs in this country, and then they go back and take their knowledge. But they don't just have knowledge. That's the beauty of the whole thing. They have contacts, because no one knows what they don't know. But what you can learn is asking somebody who does know. Samuel Johnson said there's two kinds of knowledge. There's knowledge that you know about something, and the knowledge of how to find the answer to the questions that you have. And so building relationships with universities and organizations in the United States is valuable both to the universities and the organizations. It's valuable to our society, and it's valuable to the universities to create greater knowledge. So the kind of thing you're doing is super important. Thank you, Sharif, for doing this.
Thank you, Professor Rob.
Okay. Not sure where we're going with this now. So we go back to smart materials and nanotechnology, and the combination of both, as developed in labs and applied to emerging technologies. As we mentioned before, or as we talked through before, in doing any area of research, you have to develop competencies, and that means it starts with students. It starts with colleges, so that the students are coming out with the education they need to work in the materials. And initially, because building labs are relatively expensive, partnering with other universities and other geographies that already have those facilities would probably be the most effective way to bring up the school's competency in those related areas. But I do want to point out that you really want to match the technology to the geography. In other words, it doesn't do you a lot of good to develop technology that requires an ecosystem that the country doesn't have and can't build. If you don't have the funding, if you don't have the interest, then those students, if you develop them, are going to go to another country where that interest and that technology does exist to practice their trade. You're not really helping your country. You're maybe helping the individuals, but they're going to go someplace else. So you really need a strategic plan, and the strategic plan does not start with materials. The strategic plan starts with what works best in your country, what would create the biggest difference of the development area choices that you have, and then husbanding your limited resources to focus on where you can make the biggest difference. This requires a strategic approach, and And jumping from hot topic to, I mean, graphene's great, but the ecosystem to work in graphene is fairly complex and not cheap. And it may just simply be beyond the country's resources to move in that particular area. It might be better to spend much more time with artificial intelligence applied to a particular problem. Might even be more efficient to apply the skills just directly to fixing some of the underlying problems the country is experiencing or will experience in the next couple of decades. So as we talk about this, it's the strategic approach that should overrule. We shouldn't start with the subject material. We should start with the problem and then craft the solution to the problem.
Mr. Stewart.
Yeah, you probably saw me nodding there. I think I will agree with Robert in many ways, and that I think we need to understand the problem at hand first. And I was going to bring up a quote actually, which kind of maybe which relates to small print more than I think. It was Pete Seeger that once said, "Do you know the difference between education and experience? Education is when you read the fine print. Experience is what you get when you don't." And I think this kind of comes to, and the reason I've used that is that I think education is going to be a key perspective to this. We've talked a lot today about the experience of nanotechnology and smart materials, the benefits to kind of everyday life and that. And I actually think that going back to this, I think Professor Edward, you were saying about where the funding's coming from, how it's switched from from government through to private investor. And we've seen that in many areas similar to this. And I think one of the key factors there is that we need to focus on this new education. We need to be able to develop this forward. We can't just rely upon industry to drive it forward. And I think we need to understand about vocational training. We need to be able to get the talent there, the potential, and really drive that forward. Because without that, we're kind of always going to fall short, and we're never going to really understand, not just on the development side, but going back to Robert, you're saying about actually what is the ultimate need? What are we trying to solve? What is the problem? And work back from that. However, I'm going to throw a spanner in the work now. I always like to sound a little bit different, Sharif. And I think one of the things we need to look at is that there are also potential risks that go with this. Now, we know that, nanoparticles and things are ubiquitous. They exist in the world today in nature. We're not the first to create something very small. Nature is way ahead of this, and we have developed, and the planet around us and nature has developed to manage that, so that fine particles we can cope with. And some things we can't, some things we can, but generally man-made and synthetic often creates more of an issue than the natural environment around us. So we've got to start thinking about how we work with that, and this is where we're going to see probably a greater legal focus developing around this, the legal framework required to support the education and the vocation around this. And I think also, I'm afraid to say, what comes from the government perspective which is regulation. So we're going to have to understand more and more around how regulation has a role to play in this. I exist in the investment market where regulation is something we live and breathe, and generally is retrospective. I think here we have the opportunity with this fast development to see how regulation can coexist and collaborate with this development in this area. So when smart materials start to become more applicable, they are already, as we've mentioned, but become more accessible and innovative even further in terms of everyday use, how can we collaborate and coexist with regulation to manage that as well? So a little bit of a spanner in the works, but I think it's a useful understanding with it.
Thank you, Professor Edward.
Yeah. In terms of education, I certainly agree. And I mean, one of the things I've talked about before is the need to have an education revolution, just as we've had a technological revolution, to have innovators in education look at our current systems and work to change them. It's already going on in the works. I've mentioned before that in Switzerland, 70% of kids at the high school level go through some kind of an apprenticeship program, which is basically earn and learn, where they're on the job, and it could be a financial institution, it could be a tech institution, a pharmaceutical institution. They've got something like 200 different categories, and it's kind of like a job tryout. But the other thing is, not only are they learning work ethic, and instead of getting debt, they're actually getting money. they are understanding how to work in a collaborative system. They're understanding, again, experience as opposed to, well, I read it in the book in the schoolroom. Now I'm actually in in the business building or whatever it is. And so I think that that's going to be very important. And in the future, you're going to see more of a fusion between, for example, businesses that offer internships. You see more and more, for example, Apple and Google and some of the major companies don't even require a college degree, and certainly not an advanced degree. They say, can you show that you know how to do the materials, or how you understand the materials, or how to do the work? Great, we'll hire you. And it also, again, as I think a number of people have pointed out, Rob, I know, has pointed this out before, the idea of being sort of having a multifaceted education where you don't just understand chemistry, you don't just understand physics, you just don't just understand some narrow area, but you are conversant in all of the areas. And that way, as the market changes, you can focus a little more on this or a little more on that, or you know how to integrate the knowledge, because the world is integrated, isn't it? The final thing I'll mention there in terms of regulations. I'm, as you know, I tend to be very critical of a lot of the government regulations. I'm not a complete anarchist, so please, don't label me that. At least not yet. But I understand you have to be smart about it. I know that in some of the work I've done in terms of biotechnology, there was a famous meeting, I think in the late 70s, of mostly private folks saying, well, how can we regulate ourselves? And I thought it was what they came up with, the guidelines were too conservative and actually have kept back a lot of advances that eventually came. So, I'm sort of I'm very conscious of regulations tend to perpetuate. Governments tend to be very conservative. Our Food and Drug Administration, which is right up the road from where I am right now, it tends to be fairly conservative, and therefore thousands of people suffer and die because they need to change the regulations. And now that we've had the COVID problem, a lot of the real reforms are coming through. So I'd just say be careful that the regulations don't block off some innovations that we can't imagine right now. And so just be careful about it. That's my message.
Thank you. Mr. Aaron.
Yeah, sorry. I really like what Professor Edward there was saying about something to the effect of like a tech apprenticeship sort of program. Programs like that, I'm sure there are already some that exist, but they're just going to be incredible to our, future growth. I'm a big fan of like open think tanks. It would be nice if there were some sort of centralized open think tank for things like this, and if there are, please let me know. Because this is incredible in so many ways. If you can get that actually functioning, you could have talent scouts that different startups and tech firms can send out, to scan these think tanks for their tech apprenticeships and for things of this sort. Because collaboration, again, as everybody's touched on, is the most important part of this, because life isn't about what you know so much as it is who you know and what connections and collaborative efforts you have. That's all.
Thank you. I directly want to go for the concluding remarks for today. Before that, I request everyone share our content as much as possible, and World Talent Economy Forum, Asia Research and Development Academy, Al Noor Academy, we are working together and we are trying to solving many problems, and regularly we are getting a very good support from developing nations. I want to say ecosystem, and they want to learn more, they want to engage with me more. Even when I discussing about this nanotechnology, we are getting different kind of messages and requests from Malaysia, from Indonesia. The corporation, they want to involve more with research, even from Sri Lanka, country like India, Bangladesh. So we need more collaborations. I'm sure those who are speakers, those who join today, they will be really happy to help any of the corporations or any of the government body need any kind of help. Already we are getting too much of like critical things, so we want to sit with our speakers after the sessions, if we have time in the future or next 1-2 weeks. Actually, we are developing our university project. Beside that, different energy related things and different kind of projects. We are also working with governments and different corporations. They want to do more research, but we need very good mentor like you, like Professor Edward, like Professor Rob, Professor Donald, Mr. Stewart's, even my friend Mr. Aaron. We need lot of resources, those who can collaborate, those who can help, those who can guide us. So that is the objective actually when we started World Talent Economy Forum online 1 year before. But from my personal experience, I saw the more we engage with the first world, we can minimize the gap. So we can learn more and we can minimize the gap. So this is the ultimately the way of development. So I request everyone, we need more collaboration and we are open for collaborations. Anybody need any kind of help, you directly can communicate with us, and I'm sure you can directly communicate with our mentors, our speakers. They also help you. Whatever you need nanotechnology, energies, or educations, or healthcare system, whatever it is, I'm sure they will help you. And we have around 294 episode. Beside that, we have School of Talent Economy. We are taking class and we are doing this kind of policy level discussion, so you can share with your community. So thank you everyone for joining today's session. I directly want to go for concluding remarks. First Professor Donald, then Professor Rob, then Mr. Stewart, then Professor Edward, and finally Mr. Aaron.
Well, I just want to echo what everybody else has said and make some suggestions. I always get back to Finland, and when I teach at the University of Oulu, my students are from everywhere. I mean, I have students from China, students from Spain, students from, of course, Finland, and they have a policy where they basically allow anybody from anywhere to come to the school there for free. And that makes it kind of desirable. I would suggest that if you really thought about it, you would continue to beef up your own universities and continue to invest in them. What exactly do you want to spend the money on? Why don't you ask the universities? Why don't you, as Rob said and others have said, you have your own special problems. And as I've said, and everyone said, that nanotechnology isn't one thing. Nanotechnology is materials, biology, lots of different areas, anything that's really, really teeny. One of the interesting kinds of nanotechnology that no one's mentioned yet is CRISPR. And what that is the ability to get into genes and basically slice out a piece of the gene and stick something else in there, or just slice it out and leave it gone. All that goes right into Feynman's definition of making things atom by atom, because when you're getting down to DNA level, you're working at the molecular level. And that goes back to the idea of regulation. I volunteer as a judge to the Santa Clara Science Fair every year, and they have high school students that are doing projects with CRISPR. I mean, they're inserting genes that make bacteria that glow and things like that. One, as I said before, there's one kid that's trying to make a chicken that glows in the dark. I mean, and that to me, just intuitively, is fraught with peril. Because it seems to me possible that they could make a bacteria or a virus or something like that, that, as others have said, nature balances it out. We could possibly make something that was really, really dangerous. How can we regulate that? Regulate high school kids? Okay, that's not going to happen. But it's the only way that's possible that I can think, a really good way that's possible to do it is to keep enhancing your universities. Universities compete for professors. Stanford is competing with Harvard for the top professors. You have to compete on a global scale. But if you can get professors that attract people to your universities, then you're automatically developing relationships with the countries that the students are from. That's Finland's goal, and Finland has no resources. It's a teeny little country, but it's one of the most successful countries in a lot of ways. Very high per capita income, number one in happiness, and other things that seem very valuable. So, and you can do the same thing. It doesn't require resources. I mean, it requires collaboration. And the main way that they collaborate is that their companies and their universities make a point to bring in people from other countries and to send their people to other countries to learn from them. And that's something you can do with not that much money. So that's the way, that's a way that can really help you.
Excellent. Professor Rob.
So as we look out in terms of how countries and even large companies should focus, at the start is the ability to collect and analyze data. Analytics is probably the core area to develop first, both because part of that is to first validate the quality of the data and assure it, and then make decisions based on that data, and then second, create a vision for the future that you can fit the entity into. We often see, whether it's countries or companies, dealing with the world tactically. We address one problem by putting a Band-Aid over it, but we don't spend the time to analyze the cause of the problem, and thus the problem recurs. If we really want to move the environment forward, one, we have to have facts. I mean, I understand that governments feel a need to misinform their populace to keep them in line. The problem often is that they misinform themselves and then they make massive mistakes. So there has to be a clarity of data. There has to be an ability to make clean decisions based on the facts. And there has to be an ability to create a vision of the future that you can move the organization towards. Without any of those things, you're just churning and not making any real progress. And of course, talking about progress, you need to establish some milestones so you know how you're progressing against the goals that you've set. Those are the critical aspects that often are not being taught in schools, not being practiced by politicians, and not being executed by C-level executives. And if we can fix that one part, most everything else will fall out correctly. But if we don't fix that one part, we can fool around with all the technologies in the world and we'll simply be churning. We won't be making real progress. And so focus, vision, and assuring decisions are made from the massive amounts of data we're capturing without bias. That's where I would focus.
Thank you. Mr. Stewart.
Thank you, Sharif, for my final comments. I'm sorry, I'm struggling to get glow-in-the-dark chickens out of my head at the moment. I'm just understanding that it'd be much easier for my local foxes to find them and catch them. But it brings a really important point I want to bring forward in my concluding comments. Let's go back a few years, many decades, when asbestos came into play as a material commonly used and still available in some schools where they have to take great care in removing it. The issue around the use of nanoparticles or the use of nanotechnology and a nanoparticle perspective is that this is why, had we understood through a regulatory need the issues around asbestos may have caused, and we can go on to look at things like tobacco, which I think initially was depicted as almost like a medicine for illness. It helped you cough it all up. And now we look at the response of tobacco in terms of how its impact on a variety of different types of cancers and heart disease, etc. We need to be mindful of this. So my final conclusion comment is that we need to be collaborative in nature, but we need to be collaborative across all sectors and all engagement, not try and stand alone and try and drive the industry forward alone, but understand its broader perspective, allow the governments to not just bring money to the table, but to understand how they can manage this going forward, and also between themselves. So that, as you point out, Sharif, where Malaysia and Indonesia are doing a lot of work between them in terms of the Asian market, and the fact that Japan has led this way for many years. How can we work together? So when you start to look at the more modern use around areas of technology in terms of nuclear energy, GM foods, and all these different kind of GM crops, etc., and things, we need to understand how the nanotechnology is going to have impact for, and that will relate back to smart materials, because smart materials are inextricably linked with that. So thank you for allowing me to make a contribution today, and thank you to everybody else. It's been brilliant. It's been really interesting.
Thank you, Professor Edward.
Yeah, just a few concluding remarks. By the way, about CRISPR, I was not considering that a nano process, but I guess it is a nano process. And one of the things I've mentioned in I think shows before is a couple of months ago, it was announced that CRISPR has been used to turn off and on how genes express themselves. If you consider your genetic material like the keys of a piano, and then how the piano is played is how they express themselves. The reason that's an important breakthrough is the particular work they're doing is trying to turn off the production of tau proteins in neurons. Tau protein clumping is what causes Alzheimer's. So literally, they're in labs now trying to figure out if there's a way to turn off the tau protein in neurons, meaning that if you're suffering from Alzheimer's, like my poor mom is, well, you turn it off. So again, there's another area where this is really, really important. I'd say that in terms of nanotechnology, this points out the importance of having a broad education and a broad understanding of the technologies we've discussed and the institutions that we've discussed on these shows in the past. Rob is right about understanding statistics. Donald has talked about mathematics. I've talked about a number of things as well. So I think in the future, you're going to have a lot of kids who are educated in particular areas, but having that broad understanding is going to be important because nanotechnology is not just this one little silo over here compared to other silos. It's all integrated. I mentioned also the importance, as I have before, of entrepreneurship. And that is entrepreneurs are going to figure out how to use particular nanotechnology, particular other technologies to solve particular problems. And, you know, when I think of regulation, the final thing I'll mention, I think of poor Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak in their garage. And I'm really glad that regulators didn't come in and say that they're not abiding by OSHA regulations and the minimum wage regulations and so forth. They just went in their garage and they did the damn thing. Hewlett and Packard, by the way, did something similar. We have a sort of a reputation in this country for, you know, young people just say, I'm just going to do the damn thing. And then at some other point, somebody will tell me whether I'm supposed to or not. So I love that attitude. I think that's the American attitude. I think it's a human attitude, not just American, because where I used to live in downtown Washington, D.C., just before I got married, we were right next to George Washington University. And it had, I think about half the people living in our buildings were from Asia, mainly from India and Pakistan and places like that, you know, going to George Washington University. And it was great. They were learning. And anyway, so my point here is that this is a global issue. We really should be global when we think about these issues, and just be a little bit careful about the regulations. You don't want them to get too much in the way.
Thank you. And one thing I just want to share, even developing nations entrepreneur has same story. Like they also start from very small. We know, everybody know about Steve Jobs and this kind of big names and big corporations, entrepreneurs. Like even from Malaysia, let's say, I think Mr. Stewart maybe know about Jeffrey Chiha, who developed one of the largest corporations. Example, country like Bangladesh, we have Samsung S. Chaudhary. They also build a very, very big corporation. Developing nations, I'm sure that you will be impressed if you see their story. And everybody's story is like Steve Jobs. They start with very small and step by step. So somebody start from garage, somebody start from like a footpath and this kind of area, and step by step they grow. So we have many interesting story from developing like countries as well, from India, from Indonesia, from Vietnam. So we will bring all of the entrepreneurs soon, and with their experience we will share all of the experience and develop a real collaborations. So Mr. Aaron, what is your concluding remarks, and when we want to come to Malaysia?
Well, first off, I'd like to say thank you, Sharif, for efforts like yours. They're what really makes all this possible. I think I end up saying that naturally every episode because I'm so mind blown by it. To kind of touch on what Professor Edwards said about entrepreneurship. You know, the entrepreneurs are the problem solvers and the implementers of technology in this day and age. Government's backing off a lot more in a lot of ways, and private sector really is starting to take over in a lot of areas. And you mentioned Steve Jobs, Sharif, and Steve Jobs he didn't play the biggest role in the development of the Apple computer. He was the marketer, he was the business behind it, he was the entrepreneur behind it. Otherwise, computers may not have taken off like they did as quickly as they did in the ways that they did. So it's taking that intangible concept and creating something useful out of it that the entrepreneur truly does. So really, I guess my concluding remarks are more to, the young entrepreneurs and other entrepreneurs watching your show right now. And that is to get excited about all this stuff. It's incredible stuff. Once you get excited, get motivated. We are going to be the ones doing these things. We're going to be the Steve Jobs of these areas, of these fields. And then get to planning. Planning is so understated, in describing, business development and things of that sort. So really focus on planning. I do hope to be going to Malaysia here very soon. Not only to expand some of my, business opportunities, but mostly just for the education and immersion. And getting out there and getting to meet some of these emerging tech companies in Asia Pacific, because that's really where a lot of the hive of development is going on right now. Thank you so much again.
Thank you. We want to invite you all in Malaysia. Actually, developing nations has a lot more problem, so need a lot more solutions and good entrepreneur as well. So we need global collaboration. The more the global entrepreneur will join in developing nations, they can solve many problems. And definitely, I'm sure that country like Malaysia, even Singapore and Vietnam, Indonesia, even South Asia, they are very open for that. So thank you. This is really great session, and definitely we will share our content as much as possible, and our audience, please share as much as possible. Even anybody want to join in our World Talent Economy Forum discussion, those who are entrepreneur, those who are very successful in their industry, love to do contributions through World Talent Economy Forum, you can join. And thank you everyone. I really grateful to Professor Donald, Professor Rob, Mr. Stewart, Professor Edwards, and my friend Mr. Aaron. Thank you for all of your contribution for World Talent Economy Forum. Hopefully soon we can invite you all in Malaysia, and we can arrange an offline summit. Thank you everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Sharif.
Bye. Bye. Take care. Bye-bye.
Ciao.